Well, it happened again. I saw a new science paper that I thought sounded interesting, and I started reading it, and then I fell down a rabbit hole. The subject this time, fractals. It was a rabbit hole inside of a rabbit hole inside of a rabbit hole. It all started with this press release I found out of the University of Oregon, UO, discussing a new paper from UO physicist Richard Taylor. He and his team, quote, examined the question, what happens in your brain when you walk down the street? And they concluded that urban environments are not pleasing to the human brain. Well, sure. Yeah, that's understandable, you know? After all, urban environments can be loud, they can smell bad, they can remind us of work, the air might be polluted. So why exactly did Taylor's team find that people preferred a walk in a forest to a walk down a modern city street? The reason is the lack of fractals in modern architecture and spaces. Fractals are patterns that self-repeat at different scales, and they can be found all over nature in objects like trees, rivers, clouds, and coastlines. Okay, that was not where I thought that was going at all. You know, there's been loads and loads of research showing that people experience less stress when they are in or around or even just able to look at green spaces. There's something about trees and nature that make us calm down and feel better. And I've talked about some of those studies in the past. They're pretty convincing. Touch grass isn't just an insult to get someone to rage quit a video game. It's a scientifically proven technique to improve your attitude. But fractals, that one was new to me. I know what fractals are, more or less, from a layperson's viewpoint. They are self-repeating, self-similar sets, geometric patterns that don't change a lot the further you zoom in or out. They are found often in nature, with some common examples being, you know, the way a bolt of lightning forks, the way trees branch, or even the way cauliflower grows. While philosophers and mathematicians have theorized about fractals or something related to fractals for hundreds of years, it wasn't until Benoit Mandelbrot wrapped the idea up in the word fractal in the mid-20th century that fractals really took off in research and in the public consciousness. It's no coincidence that this happened at the same time that computers started taking off, because computing software gave people the ability to fairly easily create their own digital fractals. But what's this got to do with people enjoying being in nature versus being on a city street? Well, the press release states, as soon as we look at nature, it triggers a cascade of automatic responses, Taylor explained. Even before we've noticed what we're looking at, we're responding to it. And the response is a positive one. Humans experience less stress and better well-being when looking at nature, and this is driven by fractals. Taylor's research has found that fractals can reduce stress and mental fatigue for the observer by as much as 60%. Taylor also points to research that showed hospitalized patients could heal faster when they had access to a window because looking outside and at all of the natural fractals helped patients relax their bodies and heal faster. And Taylor says that modern architecture doesn't incorporate fractals, and that makes us sad. Interesting. I was curious about how he and his team went about proving this because at first blush, it's quite complicated. You know, first you have someone's subjective experience of how much they enjoy going for a walk, which can be affected by hundreds of things, from what they had to breakfast that day or whether or not it's supposed to rain on Saturday. Once you're able to fairly compare a walk in the woods to a walk in the city, you'd need to control for all of those things that scientists already know make people feel better when they're in nature. The fresh air compared to polluted air, the sound of leaves over the sound of traffic, the lack of company over the crush of a crowd, the greens and blues over the grays and grays. Finally, once you're able to control for all of that, how do you manage to identify fractals as the remaining factor that influences how happy or relaxed we are? To answer those questions, I sought out the actual paper, which was quite difficult because the press release didn't bother to link to it for some reason. I found it published in this month's issue of Urban Science. What happens in your brain when you walk down the street? Implications of architectural proportions, biophilia, and fractal geometry for urban science. That paper is approximately 1,000 pages long. Okay, no, it's like 35 pages long, but I just got back from a week-long vacation and my brain is fried from Mai Tai, sunshine, time zone changes, and daylight savings time. So give me a break. But I spent this entire week reading all of it so that you don't have to. So let me start by saying this. Oh, although you can if you want. It is open access. Link in the description below, as always, in the transcript. Anyway, I read the paper, and let me say this. It is not an experiment. They didn't take a bunch of subjects and make them walk down a city street or through a forest while wearing portable functional MRI machines and eye tracking goggles, although that would have been dope. No, this paper is actually a summary of about 100 previous papers assembled in such a way as to make the argument that you prefer a walk in the forest because of fractals. So if you think about it, it's not a meta-analysis, but it is a scientific paper about other scientific papers, which is in itself recursive. This is a fractal paper about fractals. Thanks to my friend Joe for pointing that joke out. And I gotta say, I went into this, once I realized it wasn't an experiment, I was very skeptical, but they do make some good points. To reach the conclusion that, we prefer nature to cities because we like fractals, they support it with this. Number one, that looking at fractals makes people happy. Number two, that fractals are universally considered beautiful, regardless of, who you are or your current mood. And number three, that modern urban architecture is severely lacking in the use of fractals. And all of that put together means that we get more stressed out on a modern city street than in a forest. The evidence for number one, that looking at fractals is a nice experience, is pretty good. Fractals are pretty. Unfortunately, the press release, I have to point this out, conflates a few things mentioned in the paper. For instance, they write, Taylor also points to research that showed hospitalized patients could heal faster when they had access to a window because looking outside at all of the natural fractals helped patients relax their bodies and heal faster. But those studies on the hospital patients didn't mention fractals. It was just, they were showing patients natural versus urban environments and then seeing who improved the fastest. I couldn't find any evidence referenced in this paper that says fractals in and of themselves were the conclusion for why looking at nature had magical healing properties. That info is not there. But sure, there are studies referenced like Universal Aesthetic of Fractals that found preliminary evidence that people preferred looking at fractals that were more fractally, my word. But that leads me directly into number two. Are fractals considered universally beautiful? The title of the paper I just mentioned suggests it is, but in fact, that experiment only covered exactly the people who are always covered in these sorts of papers, 220 undergraduate college students. Every reference study that I clicked on and read was the same, and everyone still talked about the universality of preference for fractals. But okay, sure. Even those studies found very messy data, like in quantifying aesthetic preference for chaotic patterns, which involved 24 subjects from the university, self-reported creative individuals have a marginally greater preference for high F patterns, and self-reported scientific individuals preferred high L patterns. Objective tests suggest that creative individuals had a slightly greater preference for patterns with a low F. Or then there's aesthetic responses to exact fractals driven by physical complexity, which found no universality among the handful of UO undergrads who looked at exact fractals, which are, the fractaliest of all fractals. And yeah, a lot of this research, I should point out, is coming out of Taylor's lab at UO. So you're going to hear UO a lot. I have to pause here to mention that I do find it endlessly amusing that all of these studies are in effect attempting to prove that the more complicated the pattern, the more it's worth. Like Dan Flashes.
What? Because the pattern's so complicated, you idiot!
Anyway, so do humans like looking at fractals? Well, there's some messy evidence to suggest that some of us seem to, yes, but not way more than we like looking at other things. Is that Slate preference universal? In the dozens of reference studies I read, it doesn't seem that we have evidence to say so. Now, that's not to say that there hasn't been research done on fractals and people who aren't Western white university undergrads, which brings me to point number 3 from this paper, that modern urban architecture is severely lacking in the use of fractals. Now, this is another of the rabbit holes I fell down, which is architecture. I found it interesting that this paper exclusively mentions the universal beauty of cities built with classical architecture in Europe. Rome, Barcelona, Lucca, Italy. I started wondering, what about the other 97% of the populated world? Well, researchers like Ron Eglash have made their living studying fractals in indigenous cultures, pointing out that many African villages are organized in fractals, like this extremely cool village that persists its fractaliness all the way down to a tiny version of the village in each home that is built to house spirit ancestors who presumably also have their own version of the same tiny village in their village. And admittedly, I saw these fractal villages. I thought, wow, that's cool. I like looking at them. So there's a data point. I like looking at fractals. Anyway, Eurocentrism aside, this is a point where I was a little won over by compelling evidence. Modernist architecture does, in some cases, rely less on fractals compared to classical architecture and other styles as well. I'm not sure why this paper is so focused on European classical architecture when surely this should apply to every other architectural trend as well. But the entire point of modernism, as popularized by people like Le Corbusier in the 1920s, or at least the primary thrust of it, was the idea of function over form, or removing extraneous flourishes and distilling a building down to its essence, its flat, straight essence. By relying on large panes of glass and right angles and stark aesthetics, many modernist buildings do lack the complexity found in many classical architecture types. That said, modernism is a big umbrella. Now, I'm no expert, but I did spend several years writing copy for a construction contractor who worked on historic buildings around New England from modernist icons like I.M. Pei and Le Corbusier. And it was my job to learn about these buildings and write about them. Yes, so Boston has the John Hancock Center, designed as a pristine glass rectangle by Henry Cobb in 1976. But there's also, the Frank Gehry Stata Center that looks like it fell out of a Dr. Seuss book. And here's some inside info. As fun as the building looks, I heard that it's a real pain in the ass to repair anything that goes wrong. And I also heard that students hated the internal design. So it was more of form leading function. But then you have, Boston City Hall, which is often used as an example of brutalism gone wrong. Brutalism being a subtype of modernist architecture. Pretty much no one in Boston likes Boston City Hall, likening it to an alien spaceship that landed in the middle of a brick desert. It's unwelcoming and monstrous, and supposedly it failed at incorporating the true purpose of brutalism, as I heard it once, which is really to contrast large slabs of concrete with the surrounding trees and nature, not bricks. But take a look at Boston City Hall and tell me what you see. Because, maybe it's because I've been lost in this weird fractaliness all week, but I see fractals. I see rectangles in rectangles and complexity. All of this is to say, maybe there's a bit of cherry picking going on when we make a blanket assertion that the complexity found in classical architecture is better than that found in modernist architecture. And maybe all of this makes it far too complicated to say we hate walking in a modern city because there aren't enough fractals. While this paper was very interesting, and I'd love to see them try to support their hypothesis with actual experimentation, and while I did come around a bit after some serious early skepticism, I just don't think it's enough. There are so many big, obvious reasons why many large cities aren't pleasant to wander around. Possibly the most obvious being that these cities were built around cars. They're for cars to drive around, not for pedestrians. When you build a city for vehicles, when you skip out on things like sidewalks and bike lanes and small local shops, you can't act shocked that people don't love to walk around the city on their feet. Urban planners already know this, and they know that people enjoy seeing trees and water and sky, whether that's due to fractals or not. The problem is that they run up against people who profit off of cars and big box stores with large parking lots next to them and skyscrapers where people can go to work and then immediately drive home to the suburbs. But despite the lack of evidence that increasing the number of fractals in our cities would improve our lives, this paper stands by its conclusion. And why is that? I'm sure Richard Taylor is a smart and thoughtful person who is genuinely convinced that fractals will improve the world. But in 2019, he collaborated with designers to produce fractal carpeting to sell to large venues like hotel chains that he says are scientifically proven to reduce stress. And this new paper's press release proclaims Taylor is collaborating with UO psychologist Margaret Serino and architect Ihab El-Ziyadi on scientifically informed design projects that incorporate the kind of fractals that are pleasing to the human brain when viewed in the spaces people work and live in. Some examples are the fractal carpets that Taylor's team designed for the night campus and spaces like workplaces, schools, airports, and other places where people experience heightened anxiety. That same design concept could be integrated into ceilings, window blinds, and other parts of modern architecture, Taylor said. The UO collaborators have another project that develops fractal patterns for rooftop solar panels. He points to a college campus as a prime place to prioritize making architecture and design more human-centered. Imagine, he said, if students were able to look at fractals instead of simple boxes and walls on an exam morning. That would automatically reduce their stress and put their minds in a better place for the test. I should also note that he previously published a paper claiming to be able to detect art forgeries based on fractal patterns, particularly in regards to the work of Jackson Pollock, for which the Pollock-Krasner Foundation paid him for his efforts. Also of note is that some other scientists pushed back on his claim. Kate Brown, then of Case Western University, published a rebuttal claiming that she was unable to reproduce Taylor's results and that her own Pollock forgeries passed his fractal test. In a case of, wow, it's such a small world, her co-author on that paper was none other than physicist Lawrence Krauss, which viewers of this channel may better know as that physicist who bet his entire livelihood on telling the world he's not ashamed to say he loves Jeffrey Epstein, which did not work out well for him. That's got nothing to do with whether or not a guy can tell a real Pollock from a fake one based on the fractals. Just a fun coincidence I wanted to mention. By the way, the physicists are all still fighting over this whole Pollock fraud thing. I don't think any grand conclusion was ever made as to whether or not you can really tell a fake Jackson Pollock from a real one based on the fractals. All of this is to say that I see a lot of red flags here. A common warning sign that you're dealing with pseudoscience is when someone says that their particular cure can apply to anything. Like how many chiropractors think they can fix your backache, but also your neck ache. Oh, and maybe your bowel cancer too. Red flag. Throughout this week, I found countless examples of fractals being invoked everywhere. Nature, art, architecture, yes. Also, though, James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, the stock market, as argued by Benoit Mandelbrot himself, and even in the evolution of cities themselves. It doesn't mean that those things aren't all true. It just means that there's a big barrier to overcome to prove that they're true. And when it comes to arguing that something is fractal, say in the case of the stock market, you can always argue that, first of all, well, it doesn't have to be an exact repeating pattern. And second of all, that you just haven't zoomed out enough to see the full pattern repeating itself. Humans are remarkably good at finding patterns in things, even when there is no pattern to find. While fractals do exist, they are a mathematical necessity at this point. And while they're fascinating to look at and play with and consider, we need a lot more empirical evidence before we can say that the patterns we see all around us truly are fractals, let alone whether or not they are intentional when made by humans or beneficial when found in art and architecture. But go for a walk in the woods. It's still fun whether or not you're relaxed by the fractals or by the millions of other things that make a walk in the woods relaxing.